Almighty and everlasting God, mercifully look upon our infirmities, and in all dangers and necessities stretch forth thy right hand to help and defend us through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, we are now in Vol.1 of John Strype's Ecclesiastical Memorials with the Most Reverend Father in God, Thomas Cranmer. It's at one of the top shelf, maybe top one or two. It's certainly as good as, or better than McCulloch's. We're in the dedicatory portion here. The Most Reverend Father in God, John, by the divine providence, Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, Primate of all England, and Metropolitan, and one of their Majesty's most honorable privy council. May it please your grace to pardon the presumption of the obscure person that dedicates this book to your grace, for the sake of the renowned man it treats, namely one of your illustrious predecessors, an Archbishop of Canterbury, that hath so deserved eminently of that see, and of the whole British Church. This is dedicated to John Tillotson, STP, nominated by the King in Council 3 William in April 1691, a Conge de Lira, granted May 1, elected the 16th, confirmed in the Church of St. Mary Le Bow in Cheapside, and consecrated there the 31st of the same month. He died November 22, 1694, and was buried in the Church of St. Lawrence, Jewry, London. Back to Strype. I may say that deserved best of any archbishop before him that wore that mitre, to whose solid learning, deliberation, and indefatigable pains both the kings and people of this realm owe their deliverance from the long and cruel bondage of Rome. For it is true what the Romans say publicly of this archbishop, and we say it to his eternal fame, that he was the first of all archbishops of Canterbury that made a defection from the papal chair, thereby vindicating this crown from a base dependence upon a foreign jurisdiction. But whereas Parsons says that this was the first change of religion in any archbishop of Canterbury from the beginning unto his days, that is not so true. For sundry of Archbishop Cranmer's predecessors, to look no further than 200 or 300 years backward, were of different judgments from the Church of Rome in some points. His immediate successor, Warham, approved of the king's title of supreme head of the church under Christ in his own kingdom, against the doctrine of the Pope's universal authority. And a century of years before him, Archbishop Chichely, though he were made the Pope's legate, refused to exercise his power legatine further than he was authorized thereunto by the king. The Archbishop of Islip has long before him disliked of dissolving those marriages that were contracted by such as had been before vowed the single life, for though he laid a punishment upon a Countess of Kent, who being a widow, and then professed afterwards secretly married to a certain knight named Abercourt, yet he divorced them not, but permitted them to live together. And the judgment of Archbishop Arundel, who lived in King Richard II's reign, was for the translation of the scriptures into the vulgar tongue, and for the laity's use thereof. For he, preaching the funeral sermon of Queen Anne, the beloved wife of that king. After she deceased, she, in the year 1392, commended her as for other virtuous accomplishments, so particularly for her study of the Holy Scriptures and of the sense of them, and for having them in the vulgar tongue, as I find by an ancient manuscript fragment written near 300 years ago, formerly belonging to the Church of Worcester, and these words following. Also the Bishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Arundel, who now is, say, a sermon at Westminster. There was many and hundred of people at the burying of Queen Anne, of whose soul have mercy. Excuse me. And in commendation of her said that it was more joy of her than of any woman that he ever knew, for notwithstanding that she was alien born, being the daughter of Emperor Charles V. Fourth, she had in English all the four Gospels with the doctors upon them, and he said that she sent them unto him. And he said that they were good and true, and commended her, and that she was so great a lady, and also an alien. Wow, and he blamed his sermon sharply, the negligence of the prelates and other men, so that it is not true what Parsons says, if he mean that no archbishops of Canterbury before Cranmer varied from the Church of Rome in any of her doctrines. But true it is, though not so much to their credits, that none of them, however sensible they were of Roman errors and superstitions, did in good earnest bestir themselves to set this church free of them before our above-named bishop, being the 86th from Augustine. The monk resolutely and bravely undertook and effected it. Indeed, they spent not their zeal, their pleasure, and their interest this way so much as in contending about superiority and their prerogatives, and exempting their clergy from the cognizance of the temporal magistrate, in applications to and courting of the bishops in Rome, and persecuting those they called heretics, in eternizing their own names by founding religious houses and building stately palaces and shrines, and exhibiting themselves in great worldly pomp and appearance. But blessed be God for Archbishop Cranmer, by means of whose reformation succeeded a series of better, though not so splendid, archbishops, who made conscience of minding things more suitable to their high vocation and the spiritual trust committed to them. Men that regarded little or nothing the vain shows of exterior grandeur and glory, nor sought great things for themselves, but with their predecessor, St. Paul, on whom lay the care of all churches, spent and wore out themselves in the restoration of the kingdom of Christ, so happily begun by the said Archbishop Cranmer in this island. Such were Parker, Grindal, Whitgift, the three first Protestant archbishops. Next after him, what he planted, they watered, and God gave a blessed increase to, whose most excellent lives and conducts in the government of this church, as well as in more private and domestic conversation, their rare piety, prudence, patience, courage, and activity, I can scarcely temper my pen from making excursions into, of which I could fill even volumes had I leisure, favor, and countenance from those large collections which I have for divers years been storing up with great delight, partly out of their own original letters, and partly from other manuscripts in their times. But besides these first archbishops during the long reign of Queen Elizabeth, who by their care and diligence established and settled that Reformation, of which Archbishop Cranmer laid the first stones, we're beholden unto the same archbishop for all the rest of the worthy and painful prelates of that metropolitical see, who have taken care of this excellently reformed church, even unto your grace, whose deserts towards this church and the Reformation have raised you to sit in Archbishop Cranmer's chair, though with as much reluctance in you as was in him, of your graces and endowments to qualify you for this eminent position. I will remain wholly silent, knowing how abhorrent your generous nature is from reading or hearing your own commendations. Now, my Lord, is this my end in my dedication? But this it is, that you would so far encourage these while my weak and imperfect efforts as to cast a favorable eye upon them for the sake of your glorious predecessor, the subject of this book. May it please your grace, O most humble and one of your most obedient servants, John Wycliffe. Preface to the first edition. I think it fit, by way of a preface to these memorials, to admonish the reader of a few things preparatory to the perusal thereof, as to what it was put me at first upon making these collections concerning Archbishop Cranmer and the state of the church at that time, what induced me to make them public, and what credit may be given to them. As for the first, I've been for a long time not a little addicted to read whatsoever I could of the Reformation of this famous church, that I might truly understand for what reasons it was first attempted, and what methods it proceeded, by what men it was chiefly managed, carried on, and how it stood in truth as to doctrine, discipline, and government, reputation, learning, piety, and such like in its first establishment and in earlier times, for which purpose I did not only read over what we have in print of these matters, but for more satisfaction, I was carried to look on into manuscripts, whether registers, records, letters, instruments, and such like, a great sort of which by providence fell into my hands. And besides them, I've turned over many more in libraries and elsewhere, from whence made transcriptions, extracts, and collections for my own use and satisfaction, which swelled to no little bulk. While I was doing this, I took always a more curious view into the lives, the manners, doings, learning, virtues, and abilities of the chief leading men, whether archbishops and bishops, or other churchmen, of whom we have but little account extant, though many of them very great and good men, little remaining of some of them than just their names. The reverence I bore in mind to Archbishop Cranmer, father of the Reformation here in England, and the first of that ancient metropolitan see that so bravely shook off the Pope and his appendages, inclined me especially to gather up the notices I could of him. Afterwards, as my leisure served me, out of my indigested mass of notes, I compiled into some order memorials of him and of the affairs of the church during his primacy, in which for the most part he was concerned, and bore a great share with King Henry and the Lord Cromwell, his vicegerent in spirituals. After some years, these memorials lying by me, I enlarged considerably, and digested them into annals, and had thoughts of making them public, being excited and encouraged thereunto by my friends who were privy to these my doings. And indeed, many considerations induced me thereunto, as in general, the great benefit of reading the history of former times, which was, that is, take in the words of John Foxe, for the things which be first are to be preferred before those which we be latter. Then is the reading of histories much necessary in the church to know what went before and what followed after. He's quoting Foxe here, and therefore not without cause, history in old authors is called the witness of times, the light of verity, the life of memory, the teacher of life, the shower of antiquity, without the knowledge whereof man's life is blind, and soon may fall into any kind of error, as by manifest experience we have to see in these desolate later times of the church, when as the bishops of Rome, under the color of antiquity, have turned truth into heresy, and brought in such new-found devices of strange doctrine and religion as in the former ages of the church were never heard of, and all through ignorance of times and for lack of true history. Therefore, the use of history being so considerable, historians in some kingdoms have been maintained by public encouragement. And so the writer of the epistle to King Edward, before Erasmus's paraphrase Englished, propounded once to that king that there should be a public salary allotted to some able persons to translate good books and to write chronicles for bestowing so great a benefit on the Commonwealth, but particularly the history of the church and matters pertaining to religion have a more special benefit as being conversant about spiritual things, which are weightier by far and concern us more a great deal than temporal. But the more is the pity of this sort, there's a greater defect than in the other. I speak of our own nation, for though the history of the state in the last age was excellently done by the pens of Lord Herbert and Mr. Camden, yet the matters of the church they professedly decline or did but touch at. The former saying expressly his intention was not in any history to discuss theological matters, as holding it sufficient to have pointed out at places where they are controverted. And the latter in his history, as often as he came to matters of the church, tells us that he left his readers to the ecclesiastical historian, which hath made me wonder at, and apt to accuse the slothfulness of that age, that during all the time of King Henry, King Edward, and Queen Mary, wherein religion was so tossed about, took up so much of those reigns, there is no one ecclesiastical history thereof written, except that of the diligent and learned Mr. Foxe. And during the long reign of Queen Elizabeth and King James, I think none at all, till of late years, when by length of time and destruction of many original manuscripts by the civil wars, divers remarkable transactions were buried and lost. Some few learned men employed themselves in collecting and publishing what memorials of religion in the church they could retrieve, as namely Dr. Fuller, Dr. Heylin, and especially Dr. Burnet, now the Right Reverend Bishop of Sarum, to whom the English Church must ever be beholden for his great and happy pains contributed thereunto. But yet there be good gleanings after these writers, and many things of remark are relating to the church in those 3 busy reigns of Henry, Edward, and Mary, whereof these historians are either wholly silent or speak imperfectly or erroneously. Some whereof in my researches I've met with, which I've disposed in these memorials. But besides the general benefit of history, special ecclesiastical, this particular history, now recommended under the English nation, may produce this good effect, to make us value and esteem as we ought our reformed religion, where we see by what just and fair ways it went on, and how it prevailed like Christianity at first, notwithstanding great opposition it met with, and what sort of men were, such as Gardiner and Bonner, who especially set themselves to stop it. Moreover, reading the lives of exemplary men, and such as were famous in their generation, hath a great virtue in it to influence the manners of men, their wise sayings, their discreet behavior, their just management of matters committed to their trust, their zeal, their charity, their awe of God, their contempt of the world, and such like, are not only delightful to read or hear, but do ostensibly instill into men's minds a secret approbation thereof, and draw them to an imitation. The land hath produced many admirable men, the knowledge of whom and the benefit of whose examples is utterly lost, for want of some writers to leave their memory unto the world. It was a thing complained of in the last age, that as that age abounded more in writers than any age before it, so there were very few that set themselves to pen the lives of excellent men, as Samuel, the learned and worthy son of John Foxe, spake. But he ever thought it, as he said, most unjust, notwithstanding, to deprive the world of the memory of matters done by them, by whose labors and worthy deeds the common state of the country was so much bettered. And if the use of history, as the same author saith, is to form the lives and manners of men, that being the chief end of history, and I add no part of history doth more promote this than the history and deeds of famous men, was another great inducement to me to let this work see the light, to be grateful to the memory of this holy prelate that hath so well deserved of this church, and to whom under God she oweth that excellent constitution and reformed state in which she is, which cost him so dear, so many pensive thoughts, so many long hours study, so many consultations and debates with learned men, so much correspondence abroad, so many speeches, arguments, and strugglings in the Parliament, and the Convocation, before the King, the clergy, and the people, so much danger and trouble and envy, reproach, and at last his dearest blood. Posterity would be highly injurious to such a person as this, if he should not be recorded with all due respect and honor. It was a commendable practice of the ancient Persians to write in records the names and good deeds of such as had deserved well of the king and kingdom, to remain forever. In these records, kings themselves did sometimes used to read. The king Ahasuerus called one night for them to be read to him to entertain his waking hours. Xerxes, in an epistle to Pausanias, extant Thucydides, told him that his good deed was upon record in his palace forever. For these records were esteemed precious, and they were kept within the walls of the palace. And this custom of writing up the remembrance of men of merit seemed also to be among the Jews. Thus it is said of Judas Maccabeus, that the remembrance of him was for a blessing forever, to which does, I suppose, Sefer Zikaron, the book of remembrance, allude, that was written for those that feared God and thought on his name. And surely it is agreeable to God's will that this particular gratitude should be shown to men of singular virtue deceased, to keep their names and good deeds upon record, for posterity to know and to thank God for. And this office and love and duty seems highly convenient to be done towards Archbishop Cranmer, that something might appear in the world for his vindication under those many base aspersions and lying insinuations that are and have been printed by Papists to defame and blacken him to posterity. One of them hath these words, which show that he cared not what he said, so he might but throw his dirt upon the chief lights of the Reformation, the very pillars of this rank, which he names to be Luther, Bucer, Peter Martyr, Cranmer, Ridley, Latimer, Hooper, Rogers, Farrar, Taylor, Tyndall, all married priests and friars. Some of them were never friars and others never married, were men given to their sensualities, both of women and other like their commodities, after the fashion of ordinary men. Neither is there recounted one eminent action in all their lives that I've read, either of chastening their bodies, mortifying their appetites, condemning the world and pleasures thereof, while they might have and use the same, or finally any more excellent in them, spirit in them above the rest, or of any spiritual concurrence of God with their actions in any one thing. He's quoting Parsons' 3 conversions. But he did converse so much in Foxe as to undertake in 1 or 2 of his books to answer and confute him and his martyrs. And yet doth he meet with nothing more. There are none of these men in that martyrology but what was ordinary to other men, and that showed not some more excellent spirit. It is a sign he read but little there, or read with a cankered mind. This ensuing book shall effectually confute these misreports and slanders of Cranmer, one of the pillars, as he calls them, and it shall abundantly appear that he was no sensualist, nor addicted, notwithstanding his place, to the pleasures and commodities of this world. That his life shone bright by his many eminent actions of piety, mortification, contempt of the world, and that he was of a more excellent spirit than that of the ordinary rank of men, that for some ages there scarce arose his fellow, and finally that he must needs have some supernatural concurrence and mighty aid in God's grace with him. The third thing remains, which is indeed the main matter that makes an history of an account. That is, what credit may be given to what I have written. For if it stand not upon the foot of truth, it is not history but a romance, a legend, a mere tale. Here I remember what John Foxe said to Alan Cope concerning an history controller. It is true of an history writer. If you will be a controller in story matters, diligence is required. Great searching out of books and authors, not only of our time, but of all ages, and especially where matters of religion are touched, pertaining to the church. It is not sufficient to say what Fabian or what Hall saith, but the records must be sought, the registers must be turned over. Letters also and ancient instruments ought to be perused, and authors with the same compared. Finally, the writers among themselves, one to be compared with another, and so with judgment to be weighed, with diligence to be labored, and with simplicity, pure from all diction and partiality, to be uttered. Now, to measure myself with this diligence and faithfulness, I trust has not been wanting in me. I've been governed by a hearty desire and love of truth. I have read over such printed books as are of the best credit and vogue, and I have often compared them with good manuscripts, especially when I had occasion to make use of them, which I had done but sparingly and briefly, that I might not cumber the book with what hath been known and written before. But the collections I have here made and do publish to the world are chiefly from manuscript records, registers, letters, orders of council, original and authentic. For besides Archbishop Cranmer's register, in a great folio, on which I have bestowed some considerable time, I have had the perusal of several rare papers, volumes, I may say, of Sir John Cotton, preserved in his invaluable library, and of Archbishop Parker, that great antiquarian collected by him, and now remaining in the private library of Burnet College in Cambridge, among which there is a writing entitled A Declaration Concerning the Progeny, with the Manners and Trade of Life, and Bringing Up of the Most Reverend Father in God, Thomas Cranmer, late Archbishop of Canterbury, and by what order and means he came to his preferments and dignities, which I perceive was drawn up by Cranmer's secretary at the desire of Archbishop Cranmer and for his use. I've been conversant in what remaineth of the papers of John Foxe, communicated to me by the favor of my good friend William Willies of Hackney, Esquire, among which there is a manuscript life of Cranmer, annals writ by an Augustine monk of Canterbury from the year 1532 to 1538, many letters of Foxe and other learned men to him, relating to the affairs and afflictions of the church in those times, and abundance more, too, have been inserted. I have also consulted many manuscripts of great worth, originally belonging to the Lord Treasurer Burleigh's secretary, imparted to me by Sir William Hicks of Low Leighton in Essex, knight and baronet, wherein are divers of Archbishop Cranmer's letters, written by his own pen. By the kindness of the Mr. Nicholas Bately of Kent, and his great readiness and zeal to forward my design, I've received a great many material excerpta out of the registers and records of the Cathedral Church of Salisbury, and out of other books and manuscripts. William Petit of the Inner Temple, Esquire, keeper of the Tower Records, did with great humanity communicate unto me his collection of excellent papers, contained in 2 large volumes. I must mention also the Reverend Dr. Thomas Smith, Mr. Henry Wharton, Mr. Lawton, keeper of the Public Library in Cambridge, and Mr. Harrison, fellow of Sydney College in that university. And to all these gentlemen now named, I do here, as I ought in gratitude public knowledge myself. I did also consult the manuscript library at Lambeth by the favorable permission of the last and present Archbishop of Canterbury. But though there be divers shelves of very choice manuscripts, had I found little or nothing there serviceable to my purpose, unless it should please God to lengthen my life and health, to write in this method concerning Archbishop Whitgift. Neither was I successful in inquiries which I procured friends to make, from such as were relations of the Archbishop, and any matters or notices concerning him. There is one Mr. Cartwright of Nottinghamshire, that is an heir of that ancient family of the Cranmers, a worthy gentleman, and now or late justice of the peace for that county, who being made acquainted with my design, moved to impart any letters or writings that might be useful thereto, answered a friend that he was plundered in the late civil wars of abundance of papers, and not a few to that effect, but that now he had not anything left to contribute but his own good wishes to the undertaker. But still further, for the better satisfying the readers in the truth of what I write, I have, according to the good practice first begun by Mr. Somner of Canterbury, cast the most material records and original letters together by themselves in an appendix, that they may please read them there rather than in the body of the story, where it might too much interrupt the thread of discourse and making the reading more tedious, which appendix will serve as a repository for many choice monuments of antiquity, which otherwise, being in loose papers and private studies, might in time be utterly extinguished and irrecoverably lost. And I do here protest once for all that I have not inserted into this book any one historical passage out of my own head, but such as I have found either in some credible published history or in some old book printed in those times, or the prefaces and epistles to them, or lastly in some good manuscript or other. I have digested these memorials into annals and have laid matters under their respective years and months and days as near I could. Some times indeed I have been left to conjecture the true time, which I have done with as much care and exactness as by considering all circumstances I could. Yet here I am not so confident but that I may sometimes perhaps make a mistake. And if I do so, it will, I hope, be excused to me, considering that I was fain oftentimes to go by guess, grounded, however, upon the best probability I could make, the papers I use not seldom without date, sometimes of the year, sometimes of the month, sometimes of both. I thought it not amiss, though I have not observed it done in any other history, to set down under every year what bishops, diocesan, and suffragan were consecrated in the province of Canterbury and by whom. And I am jealous some of these suffragans may be omitted by me, which defect must be attributed to the registers rather than to me. I've taken particular heed to the convocations and to what was done by them, and because the affairs of the English Church have such a near relation unto the archbishops of the Church, so as their histories are but maimed and imperfect, without some respect had to those offices, I've diligently interwoven many ecclesiastical emergencies into this history, and a great many more I have been forced to omit. If any might perhaps deem this a needless work, the life of this archbishop having been writ already in the Book of Martyrs and the British Antiquities, I answer such that I have therefore been short, and it may be silent in some things more fully, more largely treated of elsewhere. But here are numberless notices given concerning the archbishop, some of which are nowhere else, others very imperfectly, besides the narration of the state and history of the church, and in most of which the archbishop bore a part. The Cathedral Church of Canterbury, now called Christ Church, I have in some places styled Trinity Church, because I so find it named in those particular records I made use of in those places, and it seems in some of the first years of our archbishop it ordinarily went by that old name. My style may be rough and unpolished, the phrases here and there uncouth, the reason of which I confess before I've taken the very expressions and words of the paper I have used. But I've chosen to do this that I might keep nearer the truth, unless by that varying language I might perhaps sometimes vary from the true meaning of my writer. The reader will find some few things here which are already published in the late specimen put forth by Anthony Harmer. He and I, it seems, lighting unwittingly upon the same records, to wit, the King Edward's Council Book and the Register of Christ Church, Canterbury. Nor could I strike out of my book what I found published in the said specimen, having fully finished it, a copy being under press some weeks before that book came out. It calls to mind what happened upon the death of the laborious antiquary John Stowe, who'd been a collector of matters for the English history 7 and 40 years and died 1605, and had all the collections of Reiner Wolf, another historian and printer in King Edward VI's days, and if he had lived 1 year longer, intended to have published all of his labors. I'm just going to shoot ahead a little bit. He's telling us how hard he worked. And there it is, September 29, 1693, Low Leighton, which is in East London. He was a parish curate there. Let us bring it to an end. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Godspeed.